The next item of business is a debate on motion 7429 in the name of Angus Robertson on people's right to choose, respecting Scotland's democratic mandate. I would ask those members who wish to speak in the debate, please press the request to speak buttons now, and I call on Angus Robertson, Cabinet Secretary, to speak to and move the motion. Up to 11 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Every member here in this chamber is here today because of the trust placed in us by the people of Scotland through their votes. Votes that had consequences, votes that, thanks to our system of proportional representation, mattered and allowed people to express their choices. That, Presiding Officer, is what democracy is about, making people's choices matter. Of course, there is more to a modern European democracy than just counting up votes, but when you start to undermine that fundamental, when you seek to deny people what they have voted for, you risk undermining democracy itself. And this places obligations on those of us who win elections. We have to do our best to deliver on the mandates that we are given. But it also obliges us all, when we do not win elections, and very few of us are elected at the first time of asking, to respect the decision of the people, acknowledge the result, and accept the right of the winner to deliver the commitments that they were elected on. Not doing that, denying democracy instead, is a dangerous thing. But it is a thing that people in Scotland are becoming increasingly accustomed to. Presiding Officer, I'm going to focus in today's debate on the outcome of 3 votes, and on the question of how we, those privileged enough to be elected to this, Scotland's national parliament, can best deliver what people in Scotland voted for. And the first of these is Scotland's overwhelming vote in June 2016 to stay in the European Union. 62% of people in Scotland, a majority in every single council area, voted to remain part of the European Union. No part of Scotland voted to leave. Yet 2 years ago, Scotland was removed from the European Union against our will. So this week, instead of celebrating 50 years of EU membership, of cooperation, of multilateralism, of solidarity between nations, of economic development, of peace, we're stuck instead counting the cost of the Tories' reckless Brexit. According to the Office of Budget Responsibility, they estimate that Brexit will reduce long-run productivity by 4% compared with EU membership. This equates to a cut in public revenues in Scotland of around £3 billion every year, heaping further massive pressure on our NHS and other public services. And these statistics are stark, and they mask the human reality of the impact of Brexit. The small businesses going under because of the price of importing, the restaurants and hotels closing rooms and services because they cannot get the staff, the firms passing on to customers their increased costs, helping to fuel record levels of inflation. The academics and scientists no longer involved in world-leading research, unable to get funding to collaborate with peers in the EU, diminishing our ability to innovate, to be at the forefront of discoveries and threatening our world-class standing. The tax revenues that could be used to fund public services, now lost, and the health and social care sectors dealing with a staffing crisis while trying to rebuild from a pandemic. Brexit is harming everyone in Scotland, and there are few reasons to be optimistic. Yes, Presiding Officer, times are tough globally, and every country is suffering from the effects of a pandemic and a global energy crisis. But decades of mismanagement, compounded by the folly of Brexit, have left the UK economy utterly unprepared to weather this storm. European countries comparable to Scotland are wealthier, have lower income inequality in a moment. European countries comparable to Scotland are wealthier, they have lower income inequality, less poverty, higher social mobility, higher and often significantly higher productivity, greater research and development spending and higher business investment than the UK does. Presiding Officer, it gives me no pleasure, none at all, to point out that people in Scotland's decisions to remain in the EU has been vindicated. And since the Brexit referendum, of course, people in Scotland have voted in every single election for people and parties committed to reversing it. In 2017 and 2019 elections to the Westminster Parliament and in the 2021 Scottish Parliament elections, a majority of MPs and MSPs were elected on mandates to hold an independence referendum so that Scotland could apply to rejoin the EU as an independent member state. Which takes me to the second of the three votes I would like to discuss. An independence referendum was on the ballot paper in May 2021 when this Parliament was elected. Don't take my word for it. Believe the leader of the Scottish Conservatives. Because he said in the run-up to that election, I quote him, "People have to be really clear that a vote for the SNP is a vote for another independence referendum." Believe the leader of the Scottish Labour Party when he said in 2016, and I quote, "Mandates come from the electorate in an election. It should be the people of Scotland who decide when the next referendum is." Believe the SNP and Green manifestos, both of which committed to holding a referendum in the clearest possible terms. And which 72 out of 129 of us here, a clear majority in the Scottish Parliament, were elected to deliver. The parties that said, vote for me and there will be no referendum, they lost. And the parties that said, vote for me and we will give you the choice of independence, won. That simple act of placing one's vote next to a candidate or party that pledged in their manifesto an independence referendum is itself an exercise by people in Scotland of their right to choose their constitutional future, a right that used to be accepted across the political spectrum, a right that the Labour government in Wales accepts. It says, and I quote, Presiding Officer, "The UK is conceived as a voluntary association of nations. It must be open to any of its parts democratically to choose to withdraw from the Union. If this were not so, a nation could conceivably be bound into the UK against its will, a situation both undemocratic and inconsistent with the idea of a union based on shared values and interests." A right, Presiding Officer, that should matter as much to those who oppose independence as to those who support it. Because what is Scotland within the UK if we do not have the right to decide to leave? Trapped, stuck, however we vote. Is that the voluntary union they claim? Which brings me to the third vote I would like to discuss. In 2014, people in Scotland were offered the choice of independence and they voted against it. And we accepted that result. But here is the question that requires an answer.
We're not independent.
After the referendum, did Scotland get what the majority voted for? People in Scotland were promised that within the UK we would benefit from the economic strength of the United Kingdom. Instead, we have suffered from years of economic mismanagement, culminating in the disastrous experiment of a failed Tory budget that cost this country billions and put the final nail in the coffin containing the UK's reputation for economic competence. The OECD predicts that the UK will be the slowest growing G20 nation over the next 2 years, apart from the sanctioned Russia. The latest OECD and IMF forecasts show that the UK is set to have one of the highest inflation rates among G7 nations in 2023. People in Scotland were promised that a no vote would secure Scotland's place in the European Union. Just before the referendum, the then leader of the Scottish Conservatives said in the STV referendum debate, and I quote, "It is disingenuous to say that no means out and yes means in, when actually the opposite is true. No remains we stay in, we are members of the European Union." Oh, really? The then Secretary of State for Scotland said in November 2013, and I quote, "The only guaranteed way of leaving the European Union is to leave the United Kingdom." And the Better Together campaign itself asked the question, what is the process for removing our EU citizenship? Its answer, voting yes. People in Scotland were promised a new era of respect for devolution and that the UK would operate as a partnership of equals. Instead, we have seen the Westminster Government use its Commons majority to repeatedly overrule the Scottish Parliament in breach of the Sewell Convention. We've seen a series of power grabs through Westminster legislation, changing and limiting this Parliament's powers again and again without our consent. And now we have the UK Secretary of State for Scotland threatening, with a stroke of his pen, to overrule a bill overwhelmingly passed in this Parliament.
Cabinet Secretary, I must ask you to bring your remarks.
Indeed. When the will of a huge majority of elected MSPs in Scotland's Parliament can be reversed by a single figure from the Westminster Government, that shows clearly where sovereignty under the devolution settlement lies. Far from enhancing devolution, giving Scotland more powers and more control, this Westminster Tory government is undermining and systematically dismantling devolution. The motion before us today says that people in Scotland's decisions matter, that their votes count, and their future should be in their hands, because this is about who decides Scotland's future. Is it the 59 MPs from Scotland or the 591 from the rest of the UK?
Please,
is it the Scottish Parliament or the Secretary of State for Scotland? Is it a Prime Minister from a party that hasn't won an election in Scotland since 1955? Presiding Officer, there is only one answer. The people decide. Democracy demands it. I move the motion in my name.
I thank Sarah Boyack for taking an intervention. If she says that she is respecting of democracy, but the policy that was put forward by her leader in August 2022 said that the role of the Scottish Parliament is to be the expression of the democratic will of the people of Scotland. And yet, Labour's amendment today seeks to remove the section in the government motion that says that the UK should be a voluntary union of nations, something that her colleagues in Welsh Labour understand. Why is it that that has been removed if Labour support democracy?
First, Christine Graham, to be followed by Sharon Dowie. Ms Graham, around 4 minutes. Please.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. Over the decades, successive UK governments have used every trick in the book to block the Scottish people's right to determine democratically their future. The current examples: the vote in 2014 was once in a generation, there is no demand, and the Scottish Government should focus on the NHS and pressing domestic issues. I'll touch on these as I progress. But I begin in 1979 with a referendum for an assembly. Better Together was in its infancy, but managed the extraordinary pairing of Labour's George Cunningham, introducing the rule that 40% of the electorate had to vote for it to count. The dead and those abstaining were counted as no. In fact, 51% voted for an assembly but failed the Cunningham rule. And then there was the intervention of Tory peer Sir Alec Douglas-Hume 2 weeks before the referendum, promising more for Scotland if it voted no. I know because I was there. We were also too small, too poor and contradictory because of oil. We were too greedy. All this, and still a yes vote prevailed against the background of a winter of discontent. Fast forward 20 years and Tory Labour, otherwise known as Better Together, has formalised its partnership and Project Fear is revisited. One of the main planks of the No campaign was that a yes vote would throw us out of the EU, and of course Labour's Gordon Brown's vow: vote no, and Labour would enhance devolution. Ring any bells? Despite all of that, Scotland voted 45% for independence. 24 years since Parliament came into being, in 1999, the SNP MSPs were in minority. We now have 64 and 8 Green MSPs, all standing openly for independence. A majority. The Unionists have 57. At Westminster, there are 6 Tory MPs, 4 Liberal Democrats, 1 Labour, 45 SNP. Yet Westminster blocks even a referendum because, according to it, there's no democratic mandate. Well, if ballot box results don't count, what does? Brexit. What a democratic affront that while 62% in Scotland voted Remain, that's from Shetland to the borders, we're out. There was no 40% rule then. The argument that the Scottish Government should focus on current pressing domestic issues, which it's doing, is the very reason why the need for independence is pressing. Economic mismanagement from successive UK governments squandering the oil and gas revenues. Norway saved trillions. In the Bank of UK plc, just a huge international overdraft. Brown's bank collapse. Trussonomics. Result: the UK has the highest inflation of the G7, leading to the right pay demands we see today. Just in the dark days of 1979, now is the very time when Scotland needs independence. And now I turn to the Supreme Court ruling, which only ruled on the limitations of the Scotland Act. I ask you to read McCormick against the Lord Advocate Obiter, where the Lord President Cooper said, I hope I get time, the principle of unlimited sovereignty of Parliament is a distinctively English principle which has no counterpart in Scottish constitutional law. I have difficulty seeing why it should have been supposed that the new Parliament of Great Britain must inherit all the peculiar characteristics of the English Parliament, but none of the Scottish Parliament, as if all that happened in 1707 was that the Scottish representatives were admitted to the Parliament of England. That is not what was done. In Scotland, the people are sovereign. Charles is King of Scots, not Scotland. Ask the people, therefore, if they want Scotland to be independent. Give them that referendum, and the reason you're blocking it is because they'd say, yes, we want to be independent.
I thank the member. Are you giving way? I thank the member for giving way. She's asking why we're talking about independence. Well, I merely ask her if she. I merely ask her. I merely put to her that her former leader, Ruth Davidson, said, if the Greens and the SNP and any of the other parties who have declared an interest in independence get over the line and can make a coalition or make a majority, get the votes in the Parliament, then they'll vote through a referendum, and that's what democracy is all about. Does she agree?
Sharon Dowie. Now call Emma Roddick to be followed by Michael Mara. Up to 4 minutes, Ms Roddick.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In 2014, I got to vote for the first time, somewhat unexpectedly. And in a panic, I read every book, blog and briefing that I could find to figure out where my ex should go. And the more I read, the more baffled I was that Scotland had let us go this long, being stuck in an archaic system that is designed not to let us make the changes and the progress that we want to. Since then, I, along with thousands of others, have voted SNP 8 times, in 2 Holyrood, 1 EU, 2 Westminster, 2 Council and 1 by-election, expressing each time my support for independence. And whether or not you agree with my position, it is a matter of democracy and a matter of fact that the SNP has a mandate to bring this question back. If Scotland cannot test the people's will to take decisions into our own hands, this is not a voluntary union. Refusing to allow a vote on something you disagree with is not the behaviour of an equal partner, nor indeed the behaviour of an institution that has any faith in its own arguments. After a shambolic Brexit, 5 Tory Prime Ministers and a multitude of welfare cuts, none of which Scotland voted for, the situation has changed and people have a right to change their minds as well. That we are here with yet another clear electoral mandate to hold a referendum, but unable to because Whitehall says no, is an outrage no matter what your constitutional stance is and how you would vote in that referendum. If there is any morality left in Whitehall, then MPs must know that their anti-democratic, nonsensical and unsustainable stance is immoral and honestly making our case for us. Our voices can't be heard in this union. We often refer to the union being broken, but honestly, this is its design. The union wasn't made to give Scotland its say. Whitehall's stance on a referendum is just the most visible example of how Scotland is treated as standard. This is what happens with employment rights, with energy policy, trade, immigration, equality, universal credit, Brexit, and I could go on. Scotland can vote en masse for SNP MPs who then vote en masse in the Commons, only to be shot down by the government of the day. One thing I think it is worth pointing out in response to criticism so far is I don't want independence for the sake of it. It's not an end in itself. I don't want to move from one bad system to another. I don't want an independent Scotland to treat disabled people the way that successive governments down south have. I want democracy here to be improved for greater community empowerment, more devolution to councils, clearer representation so that people know and understand who is making decisions that affect them. And I believe that independence would pave the way for progressive politics to happen. Independence to me is a means to an end. And in the Highlands and Islands, Whitehall has utterly failed to even begin to replace the EU funding for rural affairs and economic development that we previously enjoyed, leaving us worse off to the tune of nearly £20 million. We are struggling to replace the health and social care, hospitality and agricultural workers who no longer feel welcome thanks to a Brexit we didn't ask for and didn't vote for. Social Security Scotland provides a massive demonstration of how we can do better and be more progressive than Westminster in redistributing wealth and supporting people rather than judging, stigmatising and gatekeeping. With universal credit still being reserved, the contrast is stark to anyone who is so much as glancing at the two systems. Presiding Officer, we don't just have a mandate to deliver an independence referendum. Frankly, at this point, we have a moral duty to, for the sake of democracy and for the sake of the Scottish people. Thank you.
Ross Greer.
I'm grateful to Mr Maher for the intervention. I accept that if the Labour Party win the next UK general election, they'll have a mandate for their constitutional reforms. Why does he think then that if our side of this constitutional debate repeatedly win elections, we are somehow lacking a mandate to implement our own constitutional reforms?
Michael Mara. Michelle Thompson to be followed by Ross Greer. Up to 4 minutes, Ms Thompson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It gives me great pleasure to speak in this debate and add my voice to the just and democratic cause of Scottish independence. This is a belief I've held all my life. Independence is normal. Presiding Officer, I can taste how close it is, which is precisely why the unionists in this place get so incoherently angry. The UK is a failing state. Historically, no other state has been so dependent upon imperialism. It's created a culture and a contemporary state characterised by what Tom Nairn called a tribal state of formidable complacency. We can see and hear this tribal complacency on a daily basis. However bad things are, we are told, they could only be worse by doing something different. The UK's very own version of insanity. The entire post-colonial history of the UK is one of consistent decline and democratic failure, with Brexit being the most recent example and eloquently highlighted by the Cabinet Secretary in his remarks. As Oliver Bullard put it in his recent book, the UK has become a mere butler to the world with facilitation of corruption, replacing the exploitation of empire. The indignation that's shown when example upon example of successful smaller independent states are mentioned is symptomatic not only of UK complacency, but also betrays a failure of belief in the Scottish people regarding what is possible. This, for me, is a great divide. I choose to believe in what is possible. I choose to believe in the Scottish people, and I choose to believe, like many other small and medium-sized countries, accepting the responsibility and also the agency that will come with independence will be both liberating and enabling. We are now left in the ludicrous position that those devoted to the declining UK state, no matter the cost to Scotland, cannot state what the democratic route to independence is for the Scottish people. At the same time as we rightly support the independence of other nations, we're expected to believe that a gathering of mainly English MPs in Westminster should have a permanent veto on Scottish democracy. It's absurd and it's fundamentally anti-democratic. The enduring characteristic of the Scottish independence movement is its commitment to using democratic means. But there are multiple democratic pathways to independence, as the history of the United Nations testifies. There is no statute in international law, nor in any UN charter, that gives any state the untrammelled right to deny a nation a democratic route to independence. Now, a referendum may seem the simplest, but it's not been the most typical route to achieving independence, and the will of a people can be exercised in many ways. Take the historically significant UN Resolution 435, which paved the way for Namibian independence, which included defining a democratic process leading to an election and not a referendum. Part of that process involved the use of a UN transition assistance group, and perhaps the Cabinet Secretary might wish to consider the Scottish Government taking the initiative to appoint its own transition assistance group, drawing on appropriate expertise beyond Scotland. Presiding Officer, independence is coming, and the democratic voice of the people of Scotland will not be denied. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Thompson. I now call Ross Greer to be followed by Jackson Carlo. Up to 4 minutes, Mr Greer.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. 5 parties were elected to this Parliament at the last election. By any normal measure, those of us who believe that Scotland's future should be in Scotland's hands won that election. The Scottish Greens and SNP increased our combined majority of seats, and we won more votes, 16,000 more than the Conservatives, Labour and the Lib Dems. When people vote for political parties, they reasonably expect them to fulfil the commitments in their manifesto. So when anti-independence politicians take offence at our claim that they are opposing not just independence, but Scottish democracy itself, the question for them to answer is, what else do you call it when those who have lost an election prevent the winners from fulfilling their democratic mandate? Don't take our word for it. Ahead of last year's election, Douglas Ross said, people have to be really clear that a vote for the SNP is a vote for another independence referendum. His Conservative colleague for the Lothians, Jeremy Balfour, helpfully stated, just remember, a vote for the Green Party is a vote for independence. Former Tory leader Ruth Davidson was even clearer. She said if the Greens and the SNP and the SSP or any of the other parties who've declared an interest in independence get over the line and can make a coalition, make a majority, get the votes in Parliament, then they'll vote through a referendum. That's what democracy is all about. Back in 2016, Labour leader Anas Sarwar observed that mandates come from the electorate in an election. If they don't believe any of that anymore, it's for them to explain how they reconcile whatever their new belief is with their claim to still respect Scottish democracy. All of us on the pro-independence side of this debate accept the judgment of the Supreme Court. This Parliament cannot legislate for a referendum without a Section 30 order from Westminster. But the UK's constitutional settlement is based heavily on precedent, and the precedent here is clear. In 2011, for the first time, a clear majority of pro-independence MSPs was elected. The UK Government accepted this as a mandate for a referendum, and a Section 30 order was granted. So why, a decade later, when the Green and SNP manifestos were even clearer and independence a much more widely understood issue, have not just the UK's Tory Government, but its Labour opposition rejected this precedent? Precedent can be rejected, but if the Tories and Labour want to claim that they still respect Scottish democracy and the views of the Scottish public, the onus is on them to explain their alternative method for the people of Scotland to exercise their right to choose their own future. Yes.
Jackie Dunbar.
Thank you, and I thank Ross Greer for the My apologies, Presiding Officer, not like me. I thank the member for taking the intervention. Would you agree that it is totally undemocratic and, quite frankly, a disgrace that in 2023 we've got folk 25 years old and under that's never been able to have a say on how if their country should be independent or not, and them themselves are their own generation?
Ross Greer.
I thank Mr Barr for that intervention. I think it's a really important point. There are 500,000 people on the electoral register in Scotland who have not had the opportunity to cast their vote on Scotland's constitutional future. That, to me, is the definition of the generation that our colleagues in the opposition like to speak about so much. Winning an election used to be the uncontroversial gold standard mandate for delivering your manifesto. The Tories and Labour have trashed that democratic norm for no better reason than they lost the election and they don't like who and what the public chose instead. They need to be prepared to accept the accusations of being anti-democratic, because that's exactly what they're doing. I believe that Scotland can be a fairer, greener country with the powers of a normal, independent nation. We can rejoin the European Union and begin undoing the damage of a disastrous Tory Brexit, now also endorsed by the Labour Party. We can take basic steps to improve the quality of life for the vast majority of people who live here, like raising the minimum wage beyond the poverty pay levels set at Westminster. We can undo not just the anti-trade union acts of the post-2010 Tory government, but every bit of anti-union legislation passed since Thatcher began her assault in the early 80s. Scotland can be a beacon of workers' rights and environmental rights. We could reduce emissions and fund the just transition with a carbon tax on big polluters and end the licences of any new oil and gas fields in the North Sea. I believe in Scottish independence, but first and foremost, I believe in democracy. If the anti-independence parties are offended by the independence movement's claim to now be Scotland's democracy movement, maybe they should stop thwarting what the public actually voted for and accept that it is time to put this question to the electorate once again.
Thank you, Mr Gray.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Scots, being a historic nation with a proud past, and as a nation they have an undoubted right to national self-determination. They should determine on independence. Should they determine on independence, no English party or politician would stand in their way, however much we might regret their departure. The words of Margaret Thatcher. Perhaps Rishi Sunak might reflect on this principle from one of his heroes. After all, he believes in mandates, and I know that he does, because Reuters reported on the 15th December 2019 that during his Andrew Marr interview as Deputy Finance Minister, he said, "The overriding mandate we have from this election result is to get Brexit done. We will leave the EU in a matter of weeks." That irony surely cannot be lost to those benches. But let's turn to our colleagues on this side of the chamber here. The most powerful Scottish party for decades, who used to weigh their votes rather than count them because they were so dominant. Yet here they are, scrapping for every single vote they can muster as a result of their utter betrayal of their traditional vote, which has left them languishing in a lowly third place of Scottish politics. And yet they still have learned nothing, as Sarah Boyack has just mentioned. Keir Starmer helped launch their latest reincarnation of a federal solution to the problems of the UK. And on the 5th of December last year, he was asked by Glenn Campbell if he had the courage in Scotland to test those ideas against independence. His answer? "We have been absolutely transparent and clear about this. Those are the recommendations. We will put those missions before the electorate, and if we are elected into power, we will have a mandate to carry it out." And that's it right there, Presiding Officer. That is why Labour are finished in Scotland, because their leaders over generations believe that only mandates that are delivered by an English majority carry any value or weight. And the Scottish vote is nothing more than a means to bolster their position without the need to deliver what the people demand, and what the people have demanded them to deliver is the right to choose our constitutional future. Alex Cole-Hamilton, on the 3rd of July last year, was asked by Martin Geisler if the SNP won a general election, would that constitute a mandate? He replied, no, not at all. And yet, Presiding Officer, in the same interview, he was reminded of his own party's manifesto commitment in the 2019 general election that they would simply reverse the Brexit decision. Now, his response to that point was that they didn't win the election, but, Presiding Officer, we did. So, by the rationale of Mr Cole-Hamilton's argument, we in these benches should simply declare independence. But we won't. It's not this party's policy not to allow the people to have their say, unlike the other three unionist parties in this debate. And it's for that reasoning that the lady who deserves the final word of my contribution, Presiding Officer, is Winnie Ewing. As the opening speaker for the SNP in the Queen's Speech debate in November 1977, she said, "The national movement will not go away. If the people of Scotland are satisfied with them in a Parliament, that is what they shall have. Although we shall go on protesting that they want more. And if the Scottish people do not want more, we shall not win elections after that. It is a simple matter of democracy." Presiding Officer, it is a simple matter of democracy, and if other parties actually believe in democracy, then their own denial of it should worry them far more than the outcome of a referendum.
I thank the member for giving way. Would you accept there's 129 of us? We can deal with a lot of issues at the one time, including the short-term crisis and the long-term future.
Yes.
Gillian Martin.
As a committee convener, surely you must see, even looking at the timetable of daily in this Parliament, there's committees dealing with matters all the time in parallel with one another. That's a ridiculous thing for Martin Whitfield to say.
Well, Karen Adam, for up to 4 minutes, please, Ms Adam.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm delighted to stand here today in the Chamber to debate a manifesto commitment that my constituents voted me in to deliver. The SNP won the Scottish election with this commitment front and centre to hold a referendum. Firstly, I just want to address my colleague Jackson Carlaw, who spoke of the Tory, Labour and SNP governments struggling with the NHS crisis. Can I point out that there's a stark difference between these governments? The Tories can borrow more. The Tories can change immigration policy, but they choose not to, and that is the terrifying fact. In 2021, I included independence referendum in my campaign socials and materials, as did my opposition, but theirs was with a plea to reject an independence referendum. Now, talk about obsessive, because their materials included more talk of an independence referendum than mine. Now, I won a majority, such as my colleagues did, advocating for Scotland's inalienable right to independence, and it is on that basis we formed a government. Now, there may be cries from the opposition benches to halt or stall a referendum using a myriad of excuses, but of course we know from experience that many of these excuses to stay put in this toxic and declining union are actually the very reasons to leave it. At the very least, reasons which highlight the need for the Scottish people to be presented with the option, should Scotland be an independent country. People don't just deserve what they vote for, they have a right to it, and certainly within the parliamentary term which they voted it in. Presiding Officer, the choices I am here to make come from the people, were decided on by the people, and should be carried out by us on behalf of the people. The Unionist parties had their chance to convince the nation and they failed. They have a right to present their case to oppose independence, but they have no mandate to remove the choice. It is undemocratic and a shameful dismissal of the mark on the ballot paper that got us all here. What exactly would that be telling the people of Scotland? That ultimately it doesn't matter what they vote for because politicians in Westminster can overrule it? The Supreme Court judgment laid it bare for the world to see that this union is not consensual nor democratic, and it's something which could concern us all immensely. How dare politicians that Scotland did not vote for tell us what we can and cannot do? The patronising remarks I hear, I just can't bear. It's condescending to tell the electorate that what they voted for might not be what they need. It's pompous, it's arrogant, it's rude and it's belittling. Do they really think it's their place to tell the people what they want? We're here to give the people of Scotland what they want and what they elected us to do. We can listen to the cries of decisions of elections past, but that is a Scotland and indeed a UK that is no longer recognisable. We have been through the ringer, and much of it is self-inflicted by ideological party politics. We gave the Union a chance, and now we are reaping what was sown, and it is rotten. Brexit and a fishing sector sold out, labour shortages and red tape that could wrap the globe thrice. To the British nationalists in this chamber today, I plead, have some integrity and be bold. Stop standing in the way of democracy and be brave in your convictions. If you're that sure that they are worthy of support, then put it to the people and ask them. It's them who pay our wages. It is them that gifted us this honour. Democracy isn't just for those who agree with you. That is something else entirely. In closing, Presiding Officer, I look forward to the people choosing a fairer, richer, cleaner, more equal and outward-looking country, one which isn't constrained and stripped of all its parts in some UK scrap heap. I fully support this motion and look forward with high hopes. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Adam. We now move to
Alistair Allen.
I thank the member for giving way, and he reflected on the fact that Jackson Carlow had indicated the way forward. As I recall, Jackson Carlow said that the way forward was through making these arguments at Westminster. Does the member acknowledge that for the last few elections, the overwhelming number of people, majority of people that Scotland has sent to Westminster have been of my point of view and not his, and will he not come to acknowledge that at some point?
Yes. Maurice Golden. Stephanie Callaghan.
I thank the member for taking the intervention. He's mentioned democracy, mandates, will of the people, and he's told us that the Scottish Government is out of touch. Does he really mean that the Scottish people are out of touch because they're the ones who voted for a referendum?
Maurice Golden. I call on Neil Gray to wind up.
to 9 minutes, Minister.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Part of the motion we are debating today invites us to reflect on the recent judgment of the UK Supreme Court, a judgment that noted that votes cast in an independence referendum would possess the authority and a constitution and political culture founded upon democracy of a democratic expression of the view of the Scottish electorate. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court ruled that under our devolution settlement, a referendum to allow such a democratic expression of people in Scotland's views would be in itself incompatible with Westminster sovereignty, and so out with the powers of this Parliament. Without a change to this Parliament's powers, we cannot ourselves legislate for an independence referendum. But that does not mean that a mandate to give people in Scotland a choice about their future cannot be delivered in a Scottish Parliament election. The precedent of the 2011 election is clear. When people elect a Parliament on a clear mandate to deliver a referendum, both of Scotland's governments should listen to that and facilitate that referendum. The UK Government had no difficulty at that time accepting that a mandate could be delivered through an election to this Parliament, and they were right to accept that, and they should be doing so again now. This is Scotland's national Parliament. If a mandate cannot be delivered in a Scottish Parliament election, where can it be? And some have raised opinion polling today. Incidentally, 6 of the last 7 polls back to November last year actually show a majority support for independence. But no opinion poll can give a mandate to a Parliament. Only votes can do that. And I would invite those who would quibble with that or try to speculate about what people in Scotland really want when they elect a Parliament to reflect on the consequences of their position for democracy. After all, polls showed no overwhelming support for independence in 2011 when the UK Government accepted this Parliament's mandate to deliver a referendum. No, when it comes to exercising the constitutional right to choose their future, people in Scotland do it in the ballot box, in elections. And, Presiding Officer, I'm surprised that there is any doubt in this chamber that people in Scotland alone have the right to choose their constitutional future. It used to be accepted across the political spectrum. It was Margaret Thatcher who said, as a nation, the Scots have an undoubted right to national self-determination. Should they determine on independence, no English party or politician would stand in their way. It was John Major who said of Scotland, no nation could be held irrevocably in a union against its will. And the report of the cross-party Smith Commission said, after the 2014 referendum, that nothing in this report prevents Scotland becoming an independent country in the future should the people of Scotland so choose. It was the 1989 Claim of Right, again endorsed in votes of both Westminster and Scottish Parliaments on a cross-party basis, which affirmed the sovereign right of the Scottish people to determine the form of government best suited to their needs. None of these quotes, not even from those Conservative and Unionist Prime Ministers, describes a right to choose as long as Westminster agrees. And that is what disappoints me most today about Labour's amendment, because Labour sought to remove and delete the section in the Government's motion today that the UK should be a voluntary association of nations, and that it should be open to at any point to choose by democratic means to withdraw, something that was lifted almost entirely from a report from the Labour Welsh Government, confirming quite the distance that the leadership of the Labour Party in Scotland, and I say leadership because I don't think all of their members or voters will agree with the position, the STUC certainly does not, and that they renege on what they signed up to in the Smith Commission. They also renege on the report that they just published in August last year, which said that the role of the Scottish Parliament is to be the expression of the democratic will of the people of Scotland. So it's little surprise that opposition parties have not much enjoyed the tag of democracy deniers that's been levelled at them today. But to paraphrase Alistair Jack's duck analogy, if they try to block a debate in this place about Scotland's democratic choice today, if they refuse to accept the result of the Brexit referendum in Scotland, if they refuse to accept the outcome of the last Scottish election, and if they refuse to allow the people of Scotland to have their say over their future that they have voted for, then they are democracy deniers, Presiding Officer. And it is not simply enough to say warm words about the rights to choose. Actions are needed. It has to be made real. There is no meaningful right to choose if the people of Scotland can simply, perfunctorily be told by the UK Prime Minister no. Respecting the right to choose, putting the words I've quoted into practice means coming to the table, entering discussions, accepting, as we accept, that while we may never agree about the ultimate destination of Scotland's constitutional journey, we agree that it is one for the people of Scotland who live and work here. Now, the First Minister has made clear that this government is ready to have those discussions. It is up now to the UK government to come forward and respect the outcome of elections in this country. And so, in conclusion, Presiding Officer, Derek Bateman was a great journalist, a committed supporter of independence and a thoughtful commentator. In one article, he argued that independence can't be portrayed as a knee-jerk response to limited freedoms and imposed restrictions. The point about independence, he said, is that it is the creation of the people, not the lawyers. The people decide, the lawyers draft and the politicians legislate. It is a national cri de coeur, and he was absolutely right. The merits of independence are not for today. Independence gives us the chance to plot a different path that rejects austerity, utilises our undeniable natural resources, the talents of our people, and make our economy work for our people by tackling poverty. The merits of independence are not for today, because today, I'm concluding, because today is not for us to decide. Today is about allowing the people of Scotland to take their democratic right to choose their own future. That used to be something that united us all, but it is for the people to decide their own future.
Yeah. Very good.
Thank you.